Welcome to Clear Mountain's Wednesday evening live stream on YouTube. Today we have one of our usual conversations, which we have maybe once or twice a month. And the subject of today's is finding Chan in Theravāda, which is Chan is the Chinese root and version of Zen. That's a gross simplification, but Ajahn Kovilo is going to help enlighten us a bit about what its actual implications and details are a bit. Currently, Ajahn Kovilo is at City of 10,000 Buddhas or nearby at a Buddhist university there, and so has particular insight into this tradition. So we thought today would be a good chance to talk about some of the resonances and insights he's gained from being so near, or seen from being so near to the tradition. So Ajahn Kovilo, what would you like to begin?
I think a nice place to start would just be actually a short meditation. We can just sit for maybe 3 to 5 minutes, and I'll basically be reading a 4-line summary of the Four Noble Truths by Ajahn Dun, who's a Thai forest meditation master in the 20th century, who was actually quite influenced by Mahayana teachings, which we can talk more about. But yeah, we can just sit and center the mind and try to just come to a place of knowing the mind. Ajahn Dun's first teaching on the second noble truth is that the mind sent outside is the origin of suffering. The mind sent outside is the origin of suffering. Jitที่ส่งออกนอกเป็นสมุทัย The result of the mind sent outside is suffering. The result of the mind sent outside is suffering. ผลที่เกิดจากจิตที่ส่งออกนอกเป็นทุกข์ The mind, seeing the mind, is the path. It's the fourth noble truth. The mind, seeing the mind, is the path. จิตเห็นจิตเป็นมรรค And the result of the mind seeing the mind is the cessation of suffering. The result of the mind seeing the mind is the cessation of suffering. ผลอันเกิดจากจิตเห็นจิตเป็นนิโรธ And from that, if anyone had your eyes closed, you can open them if you're so inclined. And yeah, I think that's just a great summary of the Four Noble Truths and a great kind of bridge between teachings on Chan Buddhism, and teachings in a more classical Theravāda Theravāda outlook. And the shift from having eyes closed to having eyes open is also a good metaphor for this bridge between these two seemingly different, or at least differently named systems. So yeah, that's a bit of an introduction.
So Ajahn, if I can begin to ask you a few questions, why is, like, this is a subject which I'm really not well versed on. And so how would you broadly define Chan, and why, what's your encounter with it been over this past year? And why was Ajahn Dun's teaching uh, resonant with Chan?
So I've had contact with the City of 10,000 Buddhas, which is a Mahayana Buddhist monastery in Ukiah, California, since before I ordained even. And the Venerable Master Shunhua, who's the original abbot, the first abbot, he was kind of a lineage holder in the Chan tradition. So he was very much taught his students this way of practice. And yeah, Chan itself is a broad, a very broad umbrella term actually for many different practices. It's not very easy to define what Chan is, other than well, we can look at the evolution of the term itself. So the term which many people tuning into this channel, people who are familiar with Pali texts will be familiar with, is jhana, or the Sanskrit dhyana. So dhyana and jhana are the Indian forms, and when Buddhism moved into China, this term jhana became chana, which is oftentimes shortened to this chan. So in a way similar to how in modern translations of the Pali Canon, you translate jhana as meditation, that's oftentimes in the Chan school, Chan does not necessarily equate one-to-one with jhanas, with the 4 jhanas as we talk about them in Theravāda Buddhism, but is more a method of or is more a system of meditation, a way of meditation, which gives most importance to mind knowing mind. So I'd say that's the essence of Chan. So it's basically, to equate it with familiar terms in the Theravāda, because that's certainly what I'm most familiar with. And I won't say that I've had any deep insights about Chan, but I am very curious at this overlap. And I feel that the teachings on Chan, which I've gotten, from hearing talks of Master Hua, from reading the Platform Sutra, which is also called the Sixth Patriarch Sutra, by, as you might guess, the Sixth Patriarch, who was a Buddhist monk in the late 600s in China, one of the foremost teachings on Chan, reading his sutras, reading other sutras, having modern, present-day students of Master Hua teach their interpretations, what they've learned about Chan meditation from Master Hua, and sitting with monks from the City of 10,000 Buddhas in their tradition, and just seeing how powerful sitters they are. It's impressive, to sit in a room with someone who, can sit for 5-6 hours straight without moving. Dharma Master Lu, the abbot of City of 10,000 Buddhas, can do that. And so I have had experience with this to more or less degree, and I feel that there's something about the way that these teachings are expressed, which kind of has given me like a door into Cittanupassana, the third of the Satipatthanas, the foundations of mindfulness. in a way which I hadn't really found accessible in the Theravāda context, where things are really, mentioned in a fairly cut and dry, almost cut and paste, copy and paste setting. Basically, one remains mindful of the mind in and of itself, ardent, alert, and mindful, putting aside greed and distress with reference to the world. That's the heart or the refrain of mind knowing mind, Chittanupassana, and it's elaborated a bit, and we could go into that, but that's a bit of a outline of my history with the tradition, my experience with it, and I could also touch on the relationship between Ajahn Dun and
Maybe before you do, just you covered a lot of ground there, and I'd love to ask about one of those things if possible.
Please, yeah.
So first, Ajahn, thank you for the linking Chan to the third foundation, Chittanupassana. And, it strikes me that when I think about the focus of the Thai Theravada or the Theravada, so often the teachers put such emphasis on mindfulness of the body, the first foundation. And one thing I've always had trouble with in terms of the Mahayana sutras is they seem so high and, to me, difficult. There's a certain, I think about the Anapanasati Sutta, the mindfulness of breathing sutta, and how it sort of steps you towards through each successive foundation of mindfulness. So you become aware of the breath and the whole body. Then in the second tetrad, the steps 4 to 8, you become aware of rapture, pleasure. Then you calm mental activity. And only then do you come to this mindfulness of mind, Chittanupassana, of becoming sensitive to the mind, gladdening the mind, calming the mind, and then liberating the mind. So I'm curious, I've always appreciated that grounding. And it's interesting to me how you have this whole tradition pointing to what seems to be a higher echelon of practice. Do you feel like people are able to make that jump? Or one interesting thing I've heard is in China, there's Pure Land practice, which focuses very heavily on mantra. And I know at least one famous Chan teacher, Master Shu Yun, I believe, spoke about how Pure Land practice with this heavy focus on concentration and mantra is sort of a nice pairing to Chan practice, perhaps because it launches people into this level of bright mind where they can contemplate the mind. Just, yeah, would you speak more about how it grounds itself in this?
Yeah. It's a really good question, and I'm sympathetic. There's reading some of the sutras or the commentaries, and that is an interesting thing about the Mahayana canon. The Platform Sutra, which was written, admittedly, in late 600s, is part of the Mahayana canon. So the Mahayana canon, and it doesn't purport to be by the Buddha. It's by Huineng, the sixth patriarch. So, but yeah, reading these suttas and some of these descriptions, it does come across as very exalted. There's talk about the mind as being, in the Pali Canon you get a few mentions of the mind being luminous. There's a famous Anguttara sutta, Anguttara 1's about the mind being luminous and only obscured by passing adventitious temporary defilements. But that idea is made much of, and almost, at least in the way it's talked about, like the basis of Chan. So it's, you're tuning into, and it's given names. Basically what I just practice as knowing mind as mind, it's given these very exalted names like Buddha nature or Tathagata Garbha or the profound emptiness or suchness or thusness, all with capital letters in English, of which Chinese has none. But yeah, they're really exalted terms, but I don't so much see it as like, I've heard it talked about by other teachers as being kind of, as you related it, is the Anapanasati Sutta. You've got, start off with the body, and then you go to feelings, and then you go to the mind. But although that's how the teachings come across, they are sequential as you read them in the Pali Canon, because that's how words and sentences and pages on a book appear. You couldn't just like overlay, you wouldn't be able to read it if you just overlaid, all 16 steps of breath meditation onto one another. And I've heard people make good cases for why they feel it is sequential, but I think it can also just be a different method. Like some people, really might tune into the breath, but other people might find the breath not to be a conducive object. And other people might find tuning into the mind. So some people say you have the breath, and especially if you're taking the breath at the tip of the nose, which a lot of teachers do, not everyone, but whether you're taking the breath at the tip of your nose or your whole body, it's one object in infinite space. So you just come back. And for some people, it's almost like this, the mind goes off and you chastise it to come back to your object of the breath. Whereas with mind knowing mind, it's not that your mind goes off and then you just realize that actually the mind contains even that running off. And there's a way to create parameters, like you said, someone who can just dwell in emptiness or dwell in mind knowing mind, dwell in Chan without any supports. I would be skeptical of the capacity for most people to do that. But there are supports, like Shu Yun mentioned using Pure Land practice, having some kind of other mantra. So the Pure Land mantra of Namo Amitofo, which is basically recollection of the Buddha, recollection of Amitabha Buddha, but just as a word to bring you back. That provides sort of some level of metta, single T awareness, that if you realize that you're no longer saying that mantra, then okay, your mind has gone outside the bounds of knowing mind as mind in one level, if you're taking that as your prop. And you can really use any word. There's a whole concept of, in Chinese, it's Gong An, which is what became koan practice in Japan, or Hua To, which is basically, Hua To can be considered like the main practice of Chan, but really what it is basically a meditation word that brings you back. And in this kind of, bridge, finding Chan in Theravāda, I find that one can use the Dhammapada, as verses to bring one back to mind knowing mind in a very fascinating way, almost as a koan, not like, trying to recite, in an hour-long period, not trying to recite 200 verses from the Dhammapada, by rote memory.
I've seen you do that, but fair enough.
And that can be painful, actually. But like when you do it in a meditative way, one verse can take you an hour. One line could take you an hour. So
I think they have a strong practice of that in the Christian tradition called Lectio Divina as well. And there's a level of recitation called Unitive, where it feels like you're making up the words as you say them. What I'm struck by here, Ajahn, is first, I remember one person asking Ajahn Chah, I think it was George Sharp, why they use the meditation word Buddho, which means awake. And Longpo Chah's response was Namo Vinyana Dhatu, which means homage to the element of knowing. And another thing that's come to mind as you speak is I've heard, I believe, the different qualities of manas or intellect compared, in Buddhism, we have this term manas, which is sort of the intellectual side of the mind that gives attention to things, perceives things. And then we have chitta, which is more the subjective quality or element that tastes experience. And I've heard manas compared to the fingers and chitta to the palm. And usually manas is sort of grabbing objects and pressing them into the palm to taste. So we look at something, give attention to it like a meditation word, and then press it into the chitta. But then I've heard samadhi or deep concentration is when the object fades and all the fingers are held by attention into the palm as one unified entity of mind.
Mm.
So it strikes me as speaking a bit to what you're talking about, and also to the difficulty of, like, perhaps to really touch these deep states of mind knowing mind without it just being fading into sort of this nebulous meditation. Perhaps you
Maybe.
do need a level of concentration as well. I don't know where I'm going with that, Ajahn. Please.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, mind knowing mind in one moment, if you actually do it, if you actually know the mind, it's not like a super deep thing. It's not a super exalted thing. It's fairly surface. You just shift your perspective, broaden your perspective, expand your perspective. And I hadn't heard that description of the hand. Oftentimes mano, chitta, and vijnana are used interchangeably, but I like that. Yeah, the fingers is mana and chitta is palm. And then, I think vijnana could even be just like the whole hand, the whole body, or even, just knowing of the whole hand experience. And that term vijnana or consciousness is really, it's the knowing. And that's something which you talked about Ajahn Chah's answer to George Sharp, when Lompu Man was, talking about what's the essence of this, what is this Buddho, what is this knowing? The Buddho is the one who knows. Buddho, you're not chasing a meditation word. The focus isn't the meditation word. The focus and the point of Buddho practice, of the mantra practice, is to know or to be the Puru, the one who knows. And yeah, Ajahn Mun taught that, Longta Mahabua taught that, Ajahn Chah taught that. Lumpur Sumedho really teaches that.
Yeah,
I mean, if you want to find like a living example of someone who teaches this knowing mind is mind and bridges Theravāda and Chan without using Chan terminology so much, although he does at points, Lumpur Sumedho and Ajahn Amaro as well.
It strikes me, speaking about the non-exalted manifestations, or that's not a correct term, like the more accessible manifestations of this concept of mind knowing mind. There's something just to the concept of mindfulness, like you're saying, even in the Buddha kind of motioning to that, saying that those without mindfulness are as if dead already. There's something there. And I would say also the sound of silence. I mean, you mentioned Longpo Sumedho, but in terms of a very stable, grounding object that seems to tune into something, a broad perspective somehow, perhaps stretching the mind along with the object. The sound of silence has that quality as well.
Yeah, very much. That's my experience as well. And I think you're totally right about, even though we say mind knowing mind is not this super deep, one can do it. It does, you have to train to remain, basically. You have to train to remain in this expansive level of knowing. And that's what, you take the mind as your meditation object. And it's a more amorphous object, but in a sense, it's actually easier for some people to come back to throughout daily life. I mean, being aware of the breath during conversation is a bit difficult. Yeah, I mean, you can kind of like know when you like suck in between, every other sentence or so. But, and of course, people have, you find skill in that. But you can know mind is mind while you're talking. And I think one of the things which the readings that I've done on Chan and the meditators I've met who talk about Chan is just the simplicity of it. Basically, it's not this exalted thing. It's mind knowing mind. Just being with the simple mind and resting in that. And there's a light of consciousness. There's a light of awareness which you can tune into and make much of, and it gives reward. So,
Ajahn, on the note of the more, the brighter aspects of this, or the more advanced levels of mind knowing mind, there's a question. In Mahayana, and specifically Chan, is jhana meditation practiced?
Well, in Mahayana texts, there are the agamas, which are basically very, very similar to the Pali Tipitaka Suttas. And the agama text, mention jhana as much as the Theravāda texts do. That said, the Mahayana canon is vast. It's, I don't know how many times bigger, but I would guess at least 2 or 3 times bigger than if not more times bigger than the Pali canon. And not every school emphasizes every section of the canon. So Chan Buddhists typically don't actually make a lot out of the agamas in my experience. So and you will find Chan teachers, and especially, I didn't mention the evolution of Chan. When it goes to Japan, it becomes Zen. You definitely have Zen teachers as well as Chan teachers who say, don't practice jhanas. Basically, Chan is just knowing right here. So it's not about getting anything special. It's not about practicing the jhanas. But that said, it is possible to take the mind as your meditation object. And if that can go to jhana, I don't see why it couldn't. I can't say I have experience there, but.
I mean, speaking of pure mind practices in the Tibetan, say like Rigpa or Dokchen, I've heard some people say that a lot of those do need preparation and a level of refinement of mind to really accessible, those like pure luminous awareness practices, and that often that's skipped over when it's translated to the West because it's so romantic sounding. I don't know if that, rings true or
It's
not.
an interesting point. I think one thing, like at the City of 10,000 Buddhas, in addition to being like a Chan lineage holder, Master Hua was like a Vinaya lineage holder. So his monks are very strict, not just with all of the rules, but also with the ascetic practices. And that bleeds over and into his teaching to the lay people. They're very strict about the precepts. So there are, schools of different people who take these teachings of mind knowing mind and really overlook ethics, and that can be quite problematic. But I don't think it's that. Just I've met people in this at the university, like teachers or even fellow students who, this is like their Dhammador, just knowing mind is mind, and it's not like they had to do 100,000 prostrations to be able to shift into this perspective. So I think it really is just an individual matter, and it works for some and maybe doesn't work for others all the time.
Thank you, Ajahn. In Theravāda, is there similar practices like koans in Chan or Zen? For example, what is this? Who am I? And did the Buddha use and teach this kind of questioning approach?
Nisabho, do you want to?
Yeah, let me think about that. It does, first of all, remind me of Ajahn Jayasara was asked this, if the Theravāda has a koan, and he said, the Theravāda koan is the word dukkha. If you understand that, you understand everything. And I thought that was quite good. And there are 2 terms um, vitaka vichara, which translate as directed thought and evaluation. So it's kind of applying a thought or a perception and then evaluating it or listening to its effect. And sometimes the two are compared to ringing a bell and then listening to its resonance. And I find that, these are factors present in the first jhana and in early stages of concentration. I find that they point to a similar ethic of applying intention, but also moving into a position of listening or receptivity that mimics a question in some ways, or mimics that receptivity you get from a question. So, for example, in breath meditation, you might apply a perception of the breath, say as a white mist, like moving in and out of the body. And then one issue I think people have is they'll just continue to do, like they're just slamming on the bell again and again, and they don't really step back and like feel how it, try to taste it and step into that receptive role. I think this becomes more and more important as the mind becomes more refined, because the vichara aspect, the evaluating, in my experience, you give more time to that. Like at a certain point in meditation, maybe you only need to drop in a perception or a redirection every minute or so, and the mind will just stay in one place as it kind of listens to the resonance, um, like breath, and then just listening. Um, and I find that when you do have to direct yourself to something like the breath, um, with modern folk who are so focused on kind of efforting themselves into concentration and overly so, phrasing those directions as a question can be really helpful, like saying, what sort of breath feels good? Can I stay with the breath? And it's like an invitation. So the places I remember in the canon of the Buddha using questions have to do a lot with morality and arising heedfulness, like saying, is there anything my spiritual companions could find fault with? How well am I spending my time? Um, those are the explicit questions that are coming to mind. But these are other ways I've used questioning. And I do think the Buddha points to that ethic of listening, but in these other ways. Ajahn, what are your thoughts? And do you remember other moments where the Buddha explicitly mentions self-questioning or koans?
That was a nice answer. Yeah, I mean, the Buddha does praise. There's an instance where a student of Sona Bhikkhu, who lived far away from the Buddha, comes to visit the Buddha, and the Buddha lets him spend the night under his hut and actually asks to hear what's called the Book of to hear the eights, which are basically from the Sutta Nipata. So there were people memorizing the suttas at the time of the Buddha, and so I mean that's a practice of repetition, but repetition doesn't necessitate or entail reflection. But I mean, it's been quite fascinating since we had a Chan retreat at the university, and that retreat, perspectives from that retreat has really changed the way I relate to any sutta, basically. Especially Dhammapada. I recite Dhammapada every day, and it's become a very meditative practice. And Dhammapada 1, mind, all phenomena are preceded by mind, basically. And you can just reflect on that, all phenomena. What all phenomena? What mind? Like, where is that right now? And just letting that sit, it's kind of, I think your simile of the bell and the ringing, it's kind of like, that's the ring. Like, okay, what phenomenon? What things and what mind? And it can be quite rich. And but you have to be kind of open to it being rich, or else you just think it's a waste of time or some kind of, like the real practice is, somewhere else, so.
Thank you, Ajahn. Hi, guys. After years of meditation, I can quite easily get very peaceful and maybe a bit of piti and sukha. Yet for the half an hour more or less prior to my mind getting very still, peaceful, and happy, I am aware that I feel very bored. Bored. And I can't find the follow. Oh, yeah, I think that's the question. There's a J dot dot dot, but I don't know where it continues. So we're just going to assume that's the whole of it. Oh, it continues. It just doesn't display all. Bored. Bored just by the endless and churning of thoughts, etc. There doesn't seem to be any way around it, and I'm accepting of this sense of boredom. Yet, do you have any tips to perhaps stir my enthusiasm a bit more?
Do you want to take that, Venerable?
Sure, I'll start. Well, why don't you start, Ajahn? I'll tag on to you.
I mean, it really is true that boredom is the absence of interest. That's like a definition for boredom. So if you can add interest into the picture, then boredom is no longer, it's changed right there. But the fact that you can actually just get a bigger perspective and not hate it, I mean, that's there's a very interesting part of boredom is this vibhava tanha, or this desire just to annihilate, this desire not to experience something, which comes along with tinamida, or this like torporific mind, this kind of mind that just wants to dull out. And there's a very interesting sutta, or a couple, one where the Buddha is talking to his son, and he says, one of the causes for tinamita, or this dullness of mind, is arati, which is displeasure. So not liking something makes you dull out, and can make you get, can contribute to this boredom. And one of the solutions, or the antidote for this dulling out, this tinamita, is mudita, is it's usually phrased as gladness at other people's happiness. And if you can bring that up in your meditation, then fair enough. But it can also just be just gladness, do whatever it takes to gladden the mind. Gladdening the mind, this is one of the aspects of the 16 steps of breath meditation. So but oftentimes when you're dull and bored, I mean, it's hard to become interested and joyous about anything. So knowing it is good, but also changing postures judiciously. Because if after half an hour you actually get still and peaceful, then that's an indication that you're doing something right. Maybe it's just your mind needs to settle for that half hour. What are your thoughts? What do you think, Ajahn Nisabho? Do you have?
Yeah, the Buddha established or talked about 4 nutriments. So one's for the body, so we don't have to worry about that. But the ones that affect the mind and these are like elements that we feed on, in a sense. So specifically, contact, consciousness, and intention are the 3 kind of mental nutriments. And contact and consciousness are mixed. I mean, all 3 are kind of mixed together. Like if you see a sight, there's the contact of the senses with the sight. There's the consciousness of the form and such. And then there may be also some subtle intention to kind of get lost in that sight, which is sort of feeding off of the rush of it, When you close your eyes in meditation, you're cutting off a lot of the nutriment of contact and consciousness. Like you've been bombarded by all these sensory input, and suddenly it's nothing. So your mind compensates by relying on intention. And one of the ways intention manifests in Buddhism, like one term for intention is sancetana, which produces sankhara, these mental formations or constructs, fantasies, memories of that argument you had years ago or the movie you're going to see. So it's almost like you've cut off all the other nourishment your mind had, so it just starts churning out as much as it can. But it's pretty it's not very filling food. Most of it it's just these old dried up fantasies, like the Buddha compares certain sense desires and following on them like a dog gnawing on a blood smeared bone, getting no nourishment. All to say that if there's that sense of boredom and just, you know, rote going through this or that, it can be really good to try to begin to nourish your mind with interest and with a more robust meditation object too. So one thing you can do is try to bring in a really a wider or more active or bright meditation object, which kind of brings back in this element of like feeding off of consciousness and contact. So say you get a glow of metta going in the heart with some, powerful visualization of a friend, a puppy, um, anything. Then once that warm glow gets going, there's a sense of being genuinely interested and fed by it. And the mind doesn't need to kind of rely on this blood smeared bone anymore of the old thoughts. Um, Another thing you can do is go really narrow. So like really become interested in what's happening at the tip of the nose. Like what does that flush of the inhale feel like that sort of sunrise of the inhale? Can you track every moment of coolness in the breath like you're looking at a parade come in and out? Can you keep your mind continuous through the break between the inhale and exhale? Just become really interested in what's there. And I usually find to maintain an interest and not be bored, um, often I have to kind of put my foot on one broad meditation object, like metta, a wide field of the body, the sound of silence, or brightness, and at the same time have sort of an anchoring in a much narrower conception of the breath, like centered at the tip of the nose, um, and just kind of holding both in mind at the same time. That's actually how the Anapanasati Sutta, the mindfulness of breathing sutta, operates a lot. Is you're moving through all these contemplations and becoming sensitive to rapture and pleasure, but at each step there's this refrain: breathing in, breathing out, breathing in, breathing out, like you're always anchored in the breath. So yeah, I just find trying to bring in other sources of nourishment and interest. Okay, let's see. Second, I'm trying to find a good one. Good evening from Florida. Good evening. Ajahn Brahm said you should try variations of breath. Like when you breathe in, don't start from the beginning of the breath, but start from the end. Thanissaro Bhikkhu also gives so many methods for breath meditation.
Yeah.
For me, I feel the whole body is breathing. It becomes very interesting slowly. Ajahn?
Yeah, we only have a minute or so left, but yeah, pretty much it's the rare meditation system. Well, you do have them, but most Western monks, certainly coming out of the Thai forest tradition, I know, who teach breath meditation, say play, be curious, figure out what works for you and experiment broadly. Just to tap it back into Chan practice, you can take Chana as your huatou, as your the thing that grounds you within your knowing of the mind, and just knowing the breath as one aspect of the mind and the mind body. So you can do that. I mean, the head is not. Consciousness is not inside the head. The head is inside consciousness. Similarly with the breath. So Yeah, it's been a nice conversation, and yeah.
Thank you, Ajahn, for helping describe some of that. We'd never actually really talked about Chan, and you're sort of learning all about it down there, so I appreciate it.
Yeah.
So for those who want, you can join us on Zoom presently, and the details are on Clear Mountains Monastery's website. Go halfway down the page and you'll find a link. I'm also pasting it into the chat. And we'll just have a more intimate discussion on Zoom from 6:45 to 7:30. For those who want to join us this Saturday, we'll have our usual live stream at 9:30 a.m. And if you live in Seattle, come and join us at St. Mark's Cathedral in person. And all those details are on the site as well. Ajahn, anything else?
Nope. Yeah. Thank you, Venerable. I hope you have I hope everybody has a good evening, and we'll see people on Zoom. And yep. Good night.